The crystal chandelier caught the amber glow of the ballroom as Victoria Slade raised her glass above the waiter's head. She tilted it slowly. Cold soda cascaded down his temple, soaked his collar, pooled on the polished hardwood beneath his shoes. Then she laughed. Loud, sharp, like she had just delivered the punchline of her life. No one moved. No one spoke. The young man stood motionless, dark soda dripping from his jaw. But three things went unnoticed in that frozen room. A quiet server in the corner lowered his phone, the recording already saved. The waiter glanced at the wall clock, 5:47, 73 minutes remaining, and Victoria herself, still smiling, had ignored an email that morning about a corporate-level guest arriving tonight. So who was the man she just drenched in soda, and what exactly was he waiting for? The Harrington Grand rose 24 stories above Michigan Avenue, a tower of glass and pale marble that had hosted 3 sitting senators, 2 governors, and more Fortune 500 galas than anyone could be bothered to count. On the morning of the 30th annual Whitaker Prescott banquet, the 6th-floor ballroom smelled of lemon oil and fresh linen, and the staff moved through it with the quiet precision of people who understood that a 6-figure contract was riding on every fold of every napkin. Marcus Hayes moved among them in a pressed black vest, a name tag pinned to his chest that read, Marcus C. He was 34 years old. He had an MBA from Wharton, 8 months behind him as the interim chairman of Harrington Hospitality, and 38 properties operating under his signature across the country. None of the people folding napkins beside him that morning knew any of that. They knew him as the new hire from the kitchen rotation, 3 weeks in, quiet, a fast learner, the kind of man who remembered where every tray belonged after seeing the layout once. That was exactly what he wanted them to know. What had brought him here was a single piece of paper. 3 months ago, a resignation letter had landed on his assistant Julia's desk in New York. Not the usual 2-line notice, but 4 paragraphs written by a young man named Elliot Reeves, who had worked the Chicago property for 14 months before walking out. The letter described a manager who punished employees for imagined slights, who rewrote schedules to favor her allies, who had made Elliot's last 6 months a slow erosion of dignity. By the time HR tried to follow up, Elliot had changed his phone number and moved to Denver. Marcus had read the letter twice. Then he had asked Julia to clear his calendar for a month and book him a cheap apartment 3 blocks from the Harrington Grand under the name Marcus Carver. He did not tell HR. He did not tell his board. He told exactly one person, James Pruitt, the head of hotel security, because he needed one man inside the building who could help him move unseen. Everyone else was walking blind. 3 weeks in, Marcus had watched enough. He had notes in a small black notebook he kept locked in the apartment, dates and times, names of employees who flinched when a certain woman walked into the room. He had nearly enough. What he needed now was one final, unambiguous event. Something no lawyer could explain away. Something no HR file could bury. That woman was already halfway across the ballroom, heels clicking in steady intervals across the hardwood. Victoria Slade had been the regional banquet manager for 7 years. She was 46, with dark hair pulled into a tight, low knot, and she wore her authority the way some people wore perfume. So thoroughly you noticed it before you noticed her face. The Whitaker Prescott contract was hers. It had been hers for 5 consecutive years. When the client's lead representative walked through the ballroom doors that morning, Victoria crossed the floor to greet him with a smile that could have been framed. Mr. Whitaker, so good to see you again. How is Margaret? And Caroline, is she still at Northwestern? The smile held exactly as long as Mr. Whitaker stood in front of her. When he turned to take a phone call, the smile died so cleanly it looked like a light switch. Victoria turned, scanned the room, and her eyes landed on the linen crew. Her heels began a different rhythm, faster, harder. Marcus watched her from behind a floral arrangement, pretending to straighten a stem. He had seen this small, precise execution before, 3 times this week. The warmth was not a lie exactly. It was a currency, carefully spent only where it paid back. What he did not yet know, but would piece together later from the quiet talk of 2 other staff members, was why the currency had grown so thin. Her divorce had been finalized 11 days ago. Her ex-husband's attorney was pushing for primary custody of their 8-year-old daughter on the grounds of financial instability, and Victoria's quarterly bonus, tied entirely to tonight's event, was the only number she could put on paper to fight him with. She had squeezed every muscle of her life into a single evening, and the pressure had to go somewhere. It was going, that morning, toward a man folding napkins 3 tables away. Across the ballroom, near the service entrance, a young server named Nathan Carter stood with his phone angled casually in the cup of his hand. He was 26, 10 months into the job, and he had developed a habit over the past 4 weeks that would have gotten him fired if anyone had noticed. Every time Victoria raised her voice at a subordinate, he pressed record. The folder on his phone was named Work, which was the most boring label he could think of. Inside it were 17 video files. Marcus happened to glance up at that moment. Nathan happened to glance up at the same moment. For half a second, their eyes met across 40 feet of polished floor, and something passed between them that neither man had language for yet. Then Nathan lowered his phone, and Marcus turned back to his napkin, and nothing had happened at all. At 9 o'clock, the general manager called the staff together for the morning briefing. Richard Holt was 55, silver-haired, smooth in the way that men who had survived 20 years in hospitality learned to be. He ran down the night's timeline, the VIP list, the dietary flags. Then he added one more item. One last thing. We have a corporate representative attending tonight, not as a guest, as an internal review. I don't have a name yet. I'd ask all of you to simply do your jobs the way you do them every night. A few heads nodded. Victoria's did not. She was already scrolling her phone, her thumb moving through a stack of unread messages without truly reading them, including one email from the corporate office, flagged with an orange priority tag, which she opened, skimmed for 3 seconds, and closed. A senior auditor, she assumed, or a regional vice president with nothing better to do than walk around with a clipboard. Whoever it was, she had a 6-figure contract to deliver first. Marcus stood 6 feet behind her. He watched the email disappear from her screen, and he did not smile, but something in his shoulders settled. The briefing broke up, the staff scattered, and within 11 minutes, Victoria was standing over Marcus's assigned table, arms crossed, studying his work with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had already decided what she was going to say. Sloppy. Marcus looked up. The table in front of him was perfect. He knew it was perfect because he had laid out the same pattern 40 minutes earlier at the neighboring table, which belonged to a server named Kyle Donovan, and which Victoria had walked past with a small, approving tap on the edge. The spacing is wrong, she said, louder now. Loud enough that 3 other servers stopped what they were doing. The fold on the napkins is lazy. Look at Kyle's table. Look at it. That is what a professional setup looks like. Kyle, to his credit, looked embarrassed. Redo it, Victoria said. All of it. Marcus began to take the table apart. He refolded each napkin. He placed each piece of silverware down in the same position it had already occupied. Victoria watched the entire time. When he finished, she stepped forward, ran one long fingernail along the edge of the nearest napkin, and shook her head. No. Again. He did it again. His hands did not shake. Inside his right pocket, his fist closed once, hard, and released. He let out a breath so slowly that nobody standing 3 feet away could have measured it. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. What he had in that notebook was enough to fire one manager. It was not yet enough to reach the people who had signed off on keeping her for 7 years. When the second redo was finished, Victoria assigned him the storage run, 80 pounds of centerpiece boxes from the basement, a job that belonged to the maintenance crew, not the banquet staff. Marcus went. He did not argue. On the stairs down to the storage room, he passed Nathan Carter coming up. Nathan did not look at him. Nathan simply stepped slightly to the side, and as Marcus passed, Nathan's left hand briefly brushed the side of his own thigh, a gesture so small it was practically invisible. Marcus understood it. It meant, "I saw. I have it." He climbed the stairs alone an hour later, breathing through his nose, the centerpiece boxes stacked against the basement wall where Victoria had pointed. And when he returned to the ballroom, he found that the seating assignment spreadsheet on his tablet, the one he had spent 2 hours balancing the night before, had been changed. 4 tables were now misassigned. 3 VIPs were seated in the wrong zone. His name sat in the author field as the last person to edit the file. He already knew. He had taken a screenshot of the original document at 7:40 that morning and saved it to a cloud folder Julia had set up on a server no Harrington Grand employee could touch. He had expected this. It was the 3rd time in 3 weeks Victoria had rewritten a file and let someone else take the fall. By week 2, he had stopped leaving anything unbackupped. Richard Holt arrived 30 seconds after Victoria called him over, because of course he did. She had timed it. She pointed at the screen. She shook her head in exaggerated disappointment. She used phrases like, "I've tried to be patient, and I don't know what else to do." Richard did not open the edit history. He did not check the timestamps. He simply looked at Marcus the way men like Richard always looked at men in black vests, through them, and told him to work the kitchen the rest of the afternoon. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. He walked out of the ballroom at a steady pace. In the service hallway, he pulled out the burner phone he had been carrying for 3 weeks and typed a message to Julia in New York, still on schedule. 7 p.m. Have Linda Marsh and legal in the car by 5. Tell James to keep the back channel open. He hit send. He put the phone away. Somewhere above him, on the 6th floor, Victoria Slade was laughing at something Richard had said, and the final countdown of her career had already begun. She just did not know she was standing inside it. By 3:40 in the afternoon, the ballroom had transformed. The linen crews had finished. The floral team rolled out their last arrangements. The string quartet arrived for sound check, and the lighting designer called dimmer settings down from a ladder near the stage. The air hummed with the controlled chaos of a room preparing to host 200 guests at a dinner that had 5 years of loyalty riding on it. Marcus had been pulled from every coordination task Victoria could strip from him. The seating reassignment, the floor flow briefing, the arrival rehearsal, all passed to other servers, while he stood in the kitchen corridor rinsing glassware nobody had asked to be rinsed. He did it anyway. A man in a black vest, head down, hands moving, drawing no attention. At 4:15, Victoria found a new use for him. The mobile podium, 80 pounds of lacquered oak and steel, had to be moved from the back of the stage to center position for Mr. Whitaker's welcome remarks. 2 maintenance workers were scheduled for the job. Victoria canceled their ticket and called Marcus's name instead. She said it across the ballroom in that same clear voice she used for corrections. Every head turned. "Carver, center stage. Now." Marcus set down the towel he had been holding. He walked past 3 servers who had stopped mid-task, past the band leader tuning his violin, past the pastry chef arranging sugar flowers on a table near the kitchen door. He reached the podium, placed both hands under its base, and lifted. It was heavier than 80 pounds. Whoever had given Victoria that number had rounded down. His shoulders tightened. He moved at 8 feet, 10 feet, the legs of the podium scraping faintly against the hardwood. Victoria stood 5 paces away with her arms folded, watching. She was smiling, not the performance smile she used on clients, a smaller one, private, the kind people wear when they have been waiting a long time for something they cannot fully name. A young server named Chloe Rivers took 2 steps toward Marcus from the service entrance. She was 19. She had been on the job 6 weeks. She carried a linen cart with both hands, and she started to let go of the handle to come help him. Victoria's head turned. One look. That was all. Chloe Rivers stopped. Her hand tightened back around the cart handle. She wheeled it in the opposite direction with her eyes on the floor and did not look back. Marcus moved the podium the rest of the way alone. When it was in position, he straightened, set both palms against the edge, and quietly rolled his shoulders once to unlock them. Across the stage, Victoria was already talking to someone else, already on to the next thing. She had not said, "Thank you." She had not looked at him again. He walked back to the kitchen corridor. Halfway down, Nathan Carter passed him going the other direction, with a tray of water glasses balanced on one hand. As Nathan moved past, he slid a small bottled water sideways onto a shelf beside Marcus's elbow. He did not stop. He did not speak. The bottle was cold. Beads of condensation were already running down its sides. Marcus picked it up. He twisted the cap slowly and drank half of it in one long swallow. Somewhere behind him, a door swung closed. The 2 men had still not spoken a single word to each other in 3 weeks. They did not need to. At 5:45, Victoria came to find him. He was wiping down prep trays in the back pantry, a job so far from the action that most of the staff had forgotten he was there. She stood in the doorway and tilted her head. "Carver, come with me. I have something for you." He set the tray down. He followed her out into the main ballroom. The room was nearly ready. Candles had been lit on the center tables. The quartet had finished their sound check and stood in a loose cluster near the stage. 20 servers were at their stations, waiting for the doors to open at 6:15, waiting for Mr. Whitaker's cue, waiting for the night that would decide Victoria's quarterly bonus and her custody case, and the last 7 years of her professional standing. Marcus stopped near the center of the floor, just to the left of the main table, because that was where Victoria stopped. She turned. She had a glass in her right hand. Tall, crystal, a generous pour of club soda with a twist of lemon floating on the ice. It had been sitting on the tray of drink samples that the bar manager was using to finalize the signature cocktail. Victoria had picked it up on her way across the floor. Marcus had seen her do it, and he had known, somewhere behind his sternum, what was about to happen. The wall clock above the quartet's risers read 5:47. "You know," Victoria said, "I've been trying to figure out what's wrong with you all day. You're quiet. Too quiet. Men like you always think they're smarter than the room." Marcus did not answer. She raised the glass. She held it there at eye level for a long moment, letting the ice shift inside it. A small, dry rattle of cubes against crystal was the only sound in that section of the room. A kitchen porter at the far end of the floor had been carrying a stack of soup spoons, and he stopped mid-step, and one of the spoons slipped from the top of the pile and hit the wood with a single bright ping that cut off as suddenly as it had begun. No one laughed. No one moved. The scent of lemon oil from the morning's polishing rose up from the floorboards and mixed with the sharper citrus of the drink in Victoria's hand. She tilted the glass. Cold soda cascaded down Marcus's forehead, across his right temple, along the line of his jaw. He felt the shock of the temperature first, then the sting in his eye where a drop caught the corner. The liquid ran into his collar. The front of his white shirt turned translucent in a dark, spreading bloom. A ribbon of soda ran down the inside of his sleeve and pooled around his wrist, and he felt the drip of it reach the floor beside his shoe. He could smell the lemon. He could smell the sugar, even though the soda was unsweetened, because his mind was filling in every sensory blank it could find. Somewhere in his periphery, he registered the delicate ping of an ice cube bouncing off his shoulder and skittering across the hardwood. Victoria laughed. It was loud. It was sharp. It was a sound that did not belong to the smiling woman who had greeted Mr. Whitaker that morning. It belonged to a different person entirely. "Oops," she said. "I guess that's what you get for looking so miserable all day." Around the ballroom, 20 people stood completely still. The bandleader had his bow halfway to the strings. Chloe Rivers, near the service entrance, had one hand over her mouth. Richard Holt, who had just walked in through the main doors with a clipboard under his arm, stopped with one foot still in the hallway, saw what had happened, and took a small, telling step backward into the corridor rather than forward onto the floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to help. In the long, terrible second that followed, the only thing in the room that moved was the soda, still dripping from Marcus's chin onto the hardwood. At the bar, 40 feet away, Nathan Carter held his phone at hip height with the casual grip of a man scrolling through a text message. His thumb was not scrolling. His thumb was pressed firmly against a red dot on the screen. His face showed nothing. He had learned over 10 months on this floor exactly how to look when he wanted to be invisible. Marcus raised his head. He looked directly at Victoria, not down at the mess on his shirt, not at the floor, at her. For 2 full seconds he held her eyes. In those 2 seconds, something behind her smile went wrong. It was not fear, exactly. It was the first pale flicker of a question she had not asked herself in 7 years. His eyes were not the eyes of a subordinate humiliated in front of his coworkers. They were the eyes of someone making a list, carefully, item by item, name by name, and Victoria's name had just gone on it, in a hand she could not read. The muscles around her mouth tightened. Then Marcus lowered his gaze. He gave a small, almost polite nod and walked past her toward the service corridor without a single word. The ballroom released its breath in small pieces. The bandleader lowered his bow. Chloe Rivers turned and walked very quickly toward the kitchen, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist. Richard Holt looked at Victoria, started to say something, thought better of it, and stepped back into the hallway to take a phone call he did not have. Marcus pushed through the service door and kept walking, down the corridor, left at the break room, into the staff restroom at the end of the hall. He closed the door behind him and locked it. In the mirror, a man in his early 30s looked back at him, hair wet on one side, shirt ruined, a drop of soda still hanging from his earlobe. He turned the tap on. He cupped cold water in both hands and rinsed his face slowly. He took off the soaked shirt, dropped it into the sink, and from a slim duffel tucked behind the janitorial supplies. A duffel he had placed there during his first week. A bag none of the staff had any reason to open. He pulled out a fresh undershirt and a second pressed dress shirt, still sealed in dry cleaner's plastic. He dressed with the unhurried care of a man who had already decided how the rest of the night would go. He combed his hair back with his fingers. Then he lifted a small 2-way radio from the inside pocket of the duffel. Staff-issue hardware, but tuned to a reserved frequency that James Pruitt had set up on the security channel 3 weeks earlier, and keyed the transmit. James. A second of static answered, and then the familiar low voice of the head of hotel security. "I'm here, sir. Still on schedule, 7 o'clock at the main entrance. Bring Linda Marsh and the legal team with you in the car. Tell the front desk to turn up the secondary speaker when you radio from the curb. I want the handoff audible in the lobby." "Audible, understood." "Thank you, James." "Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman." He set the radio back inside the duffel and zipped the bag closed. He lifted the strap over his shoulder. When he looked at himself one more time, his hand, resting on the edge of the sink, was steady. His breath was steady. The countdown in his chest had simplified itself down to one number. 73 minutes, when he had raised his head in the ballroom. 58 now. When he walked back out into the corridor, Victoria was waiting at the far end, with a flat, determined expression on her face. She had clearly spent the last 15 minutes thinking about how to finish what she had started. Carver. New assignment. The coat check. He did not respond. You heard me. The coat check. Rest of the night. You don't come out. You don't interact with guests unless someone wants their coat. I don't want to see your face anywhere near the floor. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. She held his gaze a moment longer, searching for something she had felt 2 seconds earlier on the ballroom floor and had not been able to name since. She did not find it this time either. She nodded once, crisply, and walked away, her heels picking up their usual cadence as she crossed back into the lobby. The coat check at the Harrington Grand was tucked into a short side corridor off the main lobby, behind a waist-high counter with a hinged gate. Fluorescent lighting, no windows, 3 racks of hangers. The farthest corner of the building from the ballroom. It was the kind of post the hotel gave to a teenager on their first shift, or to a senior employee 2 weeks from retirement. For the rest of the night, it was also the farthest point from the public eye that the building contained, which was exactly why Victoria had put him there. Marcus walked into it at 6:14 with the duffel still slung over his shoulder. He closed the gate behind him. He set the bag down on the shelf below the counter. He placed both hands flat on the counter and exhaled. And for the first time all day, alone in that small square of fluorescent light, he allowed himself to close his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, he noticed the monitor. It was mounted above the counter, angled down, a flat black screen no larger than a sheet of paper. A feed from the lobby security camera ran on it in grainy color. The hotel had installed it so the coat check staff could see the flow of guests coming from the ballroom and prepare hangers in advance. Marcus had walked past it 100 times in 3 weeks without looking. He looked now. On the screen, in crisp overhead framing, Victoria Slade stood in the main lobby greeting Mr. Whitaker's senior vice president as the first wave of guests began to arrive. Her smile was radiant. Her hand rested on the man's forearm in that specific way that suggested long, warm familiarity. She laughed at something he said, tilted her head slightly, gestured toward the elevators, with the grace of a dancer cueing a partner. 200 guests were about to flow past her, and every single one would leave tonight, thinking she was the finest banquet manager they had ever met. Inside a dark side corridor 50 yards away, a man she had drenched in soda 77 minutes earlier watched her do it on a screen. The corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter, closer to the small, private expression a chess player wears when an opponent touches the piece he has been waiting for them to touch. The clock on the wall above the coat rack read 6:52. 8 minutes. He reached into the duffel one last time. He pulled out a folded garment bag and hung it on the back hook. Inside it was a navy suit, a white dress shirt, a dark tie, and a name tag. Not the plastic one that read Marcus C., but a small brass one, engraved in the tight serif font the corporate office used for its executives. M. Hayes, chairman of the board. He did not put the suit on yet. He laid everything out on the counter in order, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before a procedure. He checked his watch against the wall clock. He lifted the radio out of the duffel and set it on the shelf below the counter, volume turned up halfway, squelch open. On the monitor, Victoria was still laughing with the senior vice president, leading him toward the elevators, as if she had arranged every square foot of his evening personally. In a way, she had. Marcus began to unbutton his shirt. The change took less than 3 minutes. When it was done, the man standing behind the coat check counter no longer matched the name tag pinned over his heart that morning. The vest was gone. The black trousers had been replaced with the sharper cut of a tailored suit. The hair was combed neatly now. The brass name tag caught the fluorescent light in a small, deliberate gleam. He adjusted the knot of his tie in a narrow strip of reflective metal beside the hangers and watched his own face resolve into the face that had stared out of the corporate annual report for the last 8 months. He picked up the radio. He slid it into his jacket pocket. At 6:56, the side door of the coat check corridor opened quietly. Nathan Carter stepped in and closed it behind him. He had finished his last scheduled drink run at the bar 2 minutes earlier, untied his apron, and walked directly here without being seen. He came to stand beside Marcus at the counter. He did not say a word. He did not need to. He simply took his phone out of his vest pocket, set it face down on the wood between them, and rested his hand on top of it. The 17 files, the evidence of 4 weeks, right there under his palm. Marcus looked at him. "Ready?" Nathan nodded once. "Ready." At 6:58 on the monitor, a black SUV pulled up to the front entrance of the Harrington Grand. The doorman opened the rear passenger door. A woman in her early 50s stepped out in a charcoal pantsuit, flanked by 2 men carrying leather portfolios. James Pruitt stepped out of the driver's side and met them on the curb. In the main lobby, Victoria had just finished seating the last of the early VIPs in the elevator lounge. She turned at the sound of the revolving door. Her smile resumed its practiced shape. A new guest, a late arrival, probably another senior Whitaker executive. She crossed the marble floor to greet them. In the coat check corridor, the radio in Marcus's jacket pocket crackled once and came to life. James Pruitt's voice came through the secondary lobby speaker at the same instant. Loud, clear, audible from one end of the lobby to the other. "Chairman Hayes, are you ready? I'm bringing Ms. Marsh and legal up to the lobby now." Victoria stopped walking. For 3 full seconds, she stood absolutely still in the middle of the marble floor, one hand, still half raised, in the professional welcome gesture she had been about to offer to the charcoal pant-suited woman approaching her. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes did something very specific. They searched the faces of the 2 men with the leather portfolios, as if somewhere in that small group she was going to spot the name she had just heard. She did not spot him among them. Because at the far end of the lobby, from a narrow side corridor nobody ever paid attention to, a coat check door opened. Marcus Hayes stepped out in a navy suit, a brass name tag catching the light, and began to walk toward her across the long stretch of polished marble. Marcus crossed the lobby at a steady, unhurried pace. His footsteps carried on the marble the way footsteps always did in that building. Crisp, measured, inevitable. Victoria stood halfway between the elevators and the front desk, with her hand still lifted in the remains of a welcome gesture. She watched him come. She watched the brass on his lapel catch the chandelier light. She watched the name tag resolve into 2 letters she could read before she could hear them. Her hand dropped to her side. "Mr. Hayes, welcome to—" He walked past her without slowing, past the 2 portfolio-carrying attorneys, past Linda Marsh, who gave him a small, professional nod. He walked the entire length of the lobby and stopped at the coat check counter, where Nathan Carter was waiting exactly where Marcus had left him, both hands flat on the wood, his face completely still. Marcus spoke loudly enough that the nearest 30 feet of lobby heard him. "Thank you, Nathan, for what you've kept safe tonight." Nathan gave him one slow nod, then picked up the phone off the counter and handed it across. Marcus slipped it into his inner jacket pocket without breaking eye contact. Then he turned and walked back across the lobby toward the service elevators, with Linda Marsh, James Pruitt, the 2 attorneys, and Nathan himself falling into step behind him. Victoria stood exactly where she was. A minute later, every one of them was seated around the long table in the second-floor security office, and Nathan's phone lay in the center of the table, playing a video on its loudest setting. 4 weeks of footage, 17 files. The room watched them in silence, while James Pruitt's coffee cooled untouched beside the monitor. When the last clip ended, the ballroom, the raised glass, the laugh, no one spoke for a long while. Linda Marsh was the one who broke it. "Bring her up." Victoria arrived 11 minutes later under escort. She walked into the security office in the same heels that had been clicking down the lobby floor all evening, and the sound of them now was small and uncertain on the carpet. She sat in the chair James Pruitt pulled out for her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes moved once around the table, Marcus at the head, Linda Marsh on his right, the two attorneys flanking, and came to rest on the phone sitting dark in the center of the wood. "Mr. Hayes," she began. Her voice had recovered some of its polish. "I had no idea you were. I did not know who you were. If I had known, that is precisely the issue," Marcus said. "You didn't know. You assumed you could do what you did because you thought I was no one. That is the entire problem." She shifted in the chair. "It was a joke. An informal, a rough kind of joke, I admit. But our team has a very particular culture. I've poured drinks on colleagues before. We all tease each other. It's—" Marcus touched the phone. The screen lit up. He tapped a file dated the previous Thursday and slid the device toward her across the table. Her own voice came out of the speaker, calling a young woman named Chloe a lazy idiot in a tone that had nothing to do with teasing. Victoria lowered her eyes to the surface of the table. "Ms. Slade," Linda Marsh's tone was quiet, even. "We have 17 separate clips. We also have, on file with corporate, 5 formal complaints filed against you across the past 2 years. All 5 were routed through this property and closed before they reached New York. Would you like to explain that pattern?" 7 years, Victoria said. The word came out thinner than she meant it to. 7 years I have been the highest performing banquet manager in this region. I have brought in more Fortune 500 contracts than the next 3 properties combined. The Whitaker account alone. Your performance, Linda Marsh said, was built on the silence of at least 5 employees who tried to tell us what was happening in this building and were not heard. We have their statements. We have them in the file now. A man named Elliot Reeves wrote a 4-page letter in January. That is the letter that put Mr. Hayes in a black vest on this floor 3 weeks ago. Victoria's chin trembled. The practiced composure began to crack in small places, a line at the corner of her mouth, a flicker in the hinge of her jaw. "I'm going through a divorce," she said. Her voice broke across the word. 11 days ago. My ex-husband is trying to take my daughter. She is 8 years old. I needed tonight to work. I needed the bonus. I have not slept more than 4 hours in a week. I am not excusing what I did. I am telling you, I am not a monster. I am telling you there is a reason I— For a long moment, the room held only the sound of her breathing and the low hum of the ceiling lights. Marcus spoke gently. "I'm sorry about your daughter. I mean that. Divorce is hard, and custody is harder, and I would not wish the last 11 days of your life on anyone in this room. But Nathan Carter has a son. He is 2 years old. The employee you used a certain word about in February has 2 children. Elliot Reeves, the man whose letter brought me here, has a wife and a family in Denver who are still recovering from what this job did to him. Each one of them was carrying something heavy when they walked into this building. None of them poured it onto the people working beside them. The last offense rose in her, the way last offenses do, harder, sharper, because it was the only one left. If you weren't the chairman of this company," she said, her voice louder now, her shoulders squaring, "then what happened in that ballroom is a bad joke between co-workers. You are sitting here using the authority of this title to punish a lapse in judgment that, at any other table, would be a conversation between 2 adults. You are making an example out of me because of who you are." Marcus let the sentence hang in the air for 3 long beats. "That," he said, "is exactly the question I want you to answer. Not to me, to yourself. If I were not the chairman, would you have done it? Would you have raised that glass above the head of a man who could walk out of this building tomorrow and never cross your path again, if there had been no cost? You just told me it was only a joke. So tell me now, would you have poured that drink on me in front of 200 people if you had known who I was? Her mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. And this time, nothing came out. That is the answer, Marcus said. Not whether I am the chairman, whether you do it when you believe no one is. You are suspended without pay, effective this moment. Legal will be in touch with you on Monday morning. James will walk you to the staff exit. Richard Holt was brought in 20 minutes later. The conversation with him was shorter. Marcus did not raise his voice. He simply placed a folder on the table containing copies of 5 complaint forms filed against Victoria Slade between 2024 and 2026, each one stamped closed by Richard's own signature. You had 5 of these, Richard, on your desk, over 2 years. What did you do with them? Richard Holt opened his mouth to answer and found that he had no answer and shut it again. He was removed from the property within the hour. The internal investigation ran for 10 days before anything reached the public. Marcus did not call a press conference. He did not release Nathan's footage. Instead, he spent those 10 days on his own phone, working through a list. He called Elliot Reeves in Denver. He called a woman named Patricia, who had left the Harrington Grand 2 years earlier and now worked in a hospital cafeteria in Milwaukee. He called 3 others. He apologized, personally by name, for what the company had failed to do. He listened. He wrote things down. The video only became public when one of those former employees asked him to make it public. She said she wanted other people in other buildings to know they were not alone. Marcus agreed. The footage went out through the company's official channels on a Tuesday morning and was viewed 11 million times by the weekend. Victoria Slade was terminated. A civil suit followed. Richard Holt was demoted to a junior coordinator position in a secondary market. A full investigation opened across all 38 Harrington hospitality properties. Nathan Carter was promoted into a newly created role. Marcus flew him to New York and installed him as the first manager of what the company began calling the Frontline Voices program, an independent anonymous reporting line, staffed by an outside firm, answerable only to the board. Nathan's job was to make sure that when another letter, like Elliot Reeves's, landed on someone's desk, it reached the top floor within a week, not a year. 3 months after the night of the banquet, Marcus Hayes stood in the corporate auditorium on the 22nd floor of Harrington Hospitality's New York headquarters and was formally installed as chairman of the board in front of every general manager from every property the company owned. He walked to the podium without notes. The teleprompter was dark. "I have stood at the bottom of this organization," he said. "I know what the kitchen at the Harrington Grand smells like at 6 in the morning. I know what it feels like to be looked through, to be standing in a room and have people talk across you as if you are not a person at all. And that is exactly how I know what needs to change." He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not mention Victoria Slade by name. He did not mention Richard Holt. He mentioned Elliot Reeves. He mentioned Nathan Carter. He mentioned 5 others who had written letters and not been heard. He ended with a question, and he made it the opening question of every board meeting from that day forward. Is there anyone in this company tonight who feels invisible? Later that evening, alone in the chairman's office on the 22nd floor, he opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside it were 2 objects. The first was a plastic name tag that read Marcos C., its edge slightly bent from 3 weeks of wear. The second was a small framed photograph taken earlier that month of Nathan Carter standing at a podium in a new charcoal suit, speaking to a room full of new hires he had never met before, but would now, for as long as the program existed, spend the rest of his career protecting. Marcus looked at them both for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer.